Hi, I'm Dr. Philip McMillan. Thank you for joining me. Glad to be back in front of the camera again after a short time away. And today I'm going to be asking a simple question about what is your vax risk for autoimmunity? And there's a reason why I'm asking this question. It's not just that this is one of these circular arguments, but this is very, very relevant, especially in the context of my research around autoimmunity. For anyone who has not been interacting or seen me before, my angle has always been that I have said from the start of the pandemic in early 2020 that this disease, severe COVID-19, is behaving like a viral mediated autoimmune disease. Essentially, what that means is that the infection triggers the immune system to attack itself, and that's essentially the cytokine storm. And so, within that context, I've always been very cautious about any intervention that intervenes with the immune system. That's why I'm still talking about this. And this is why I'm raising this very important yet simple question. So, within any organization, there is going to be a health and safety cohort or officer or a group, a risk management group. And I would think that at this point in the pandemic, it would certainly be wise for every single company that mandated the vaccine to be at least cognizant of some of the potential risks. So the way how it works in a normal health and safety strategies, first thing you have to do is identify your risk. Once you've identified the risk, you then assess it to see whether or not the risk is relevant. It could be low probability, could be medium, could be high probability. If you think it's relevant, you try and control these risks. And then what you do is review these risks. And this is what every company does in the context of the law, health and safety. So, my question is really, have they done this health and safety assessment at a population level, at a company level, at an organization level? Because we are now coming 4 years in the pandemic, this is relevant because the virus is still circulating. So let's get back again to the basics as to why I'm highlighting this point. So here we have the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And you can see there, it's as usual, that ball on the screen. And on the surface of it are multiple blue areas here that we call spike proteins. And these spike proteins are like the key to open the lock to get inside the cell. Once the virus gets inside the cell using this key or the spike protein, it can then replicate to make thousands of other viral particles which can spread. And that's essentially what the virus does. And so the spike protein is critical in the context of infecting the cell. But we're starting to realize, or well, I realized this a long time ago, that this spike protein is also critical with regards to triggering the cytokine storm. Now, again, some in the scientific community can argue about autoimmunity as to whether or not it is the primary mechanism of the cytokine storm or it's a secondary mechanism, but it certainly happens in the context of an autoimmune response. And so, recognizing that and highlighting as well that important point that when we look at COVID 19 infection, there was a 46% relative risk increase of autoimmunity. And this was noted across a broad population group. So we know autoimmunity occurs, certainly with regards to infection. And again, if it's related to the spike protein, then you should ask from a scientific perspective, could this also occur with any other source of the spike protein? Essentially, what it is that we think is happening here, you can see here, this is the same spike protein in the center. And what you can have is specific proteins can bind to the spike protein. In this here, I have an image of DC sign. There's neuropilin 1, there's furin. ACE2 is the entry receptor that can bind as well. So if you had free floating protein, could it bind to the spike protein of the virus? And if it did, could this trigger an autoimmune response? That means that essentially the immune system, when it targets the spike protein, it then can't differentiate between the spike protein of the virus and a normal protein. I think, in terms of analogies, it's kind of like eating fish. You're eating a piece of salmon, there's a small bone in it. You're trying to see if you can chew without chewing the bone, and that's how a bone can get stuck in your throat because you could miss the bone while you're chewing the salmon. That's kind of like what could happen with the immune system. It misses the fact that a protein here, which is not normally one that would want to target, gets caught up in the immune response. And that's essentially the fundamentals of autoimmunity around the infection. So the question is, can that also happen with regards to the spike protein from any other source? Now, that's a health and safety question. Identifying, is it a risk? Now, if organizations have not asked that question, that's a failure in terms of health and safety. Even if they thought it was a minimal probability, you still ask the question, is it possible? Could it be relevant? That's the second part of the question. That's assessing it. But what it seems is that a significant proportion of individuals, organizations, governments don't want to even acknowledge the potential risk. That's a health and safety risk. I can warn you, because if it turns out that you haven't even assessed it, you have no leg to stand on from a legal perspective. Very, very important. Here is now again me showing you what I think happens in terms of infection potentially. And there's a reason why this is important. Again, I've used the same spike protein and we've blown it up here. And I've shown that these proteins could be attached to it. Now we know this happens. The frequency is difficult to assess. But if this happens in infection and it can trigger an autoimmune response, here is where we get a really complicated situation. So when I was thinking about it, I was trying to see if I could work out that question in my mind. If I was part of a health and safety executive, how would I approach this question? So you have to forgive me for a quick mock-up of my thoughts. Here is what I've got. I've assessed what is a vaccinated autoimmune risk profile. Now, there are a significant number of people, and this is probably the vast majority, who have good mucosal immunity. They may have been exposed before or not. Even if they got a vaccine, it didn't damage significantly that mucosal immunity. That's very important because if the virus can't get through the upper airway into the bloodstream, that would suggest it's low risk. However, what happens if the mucosal immunity is impaired? And in that case, you could have people with a few infections. And I would think that at any point, there are two sources of spike protein in this case, one from the injection and the other one from the infection. That would represent to me a moderate risk. And then you have another cohort, and this is probably the group that has interferon autoantibodies, really struggling to control the infection, and they have recurrent infections. Now, depending on whether or not there are health comorbidities associated, diabetes, hypertension, any other thing, any other risk factor underneath, that could then become a high risk cohort. I would suspect I should have probably put a line here going to moderate risk, which would, in my mind, indicate if there were no health comorbidities, whilst there is a risk, that risk would be lower because of the interaction with the spike protein. That's just my mock up of some thoughts. But the point is that this should be being done across the board. It doesn't matter what someone's ideological perspective is on this. There are some people who think you shouldn't even ask the question. It's just ridiculous. It's anti vax. As far as I'm concerned, that's inappropriate. It's not relevant. This is a scientific question. This is a health and safety question. Once you have identified the potential risk, what you then do is you can then throw it out because you say this is only going to happen in such a small percentage of individuals that it's not even worth the time to reflect on in terms of putting together a strategy. Again, just a bit of advice going forward. And this is where I think we have to be very, very careful when we think about what it is that is likely to happen in the future. I predict that because we have a situation where herd immunity in highly vaccinated regions is unlikely to occur because the virus continues to circulate, what it means is theoretically that you have a situation where there is ongoing exposure to spike protein. If this occurs in the context of the group of people who are in the practical sense of the word, in the health comorbidity groups, meaning that they have health comorbidities and they're getting recurrent infections, I would suggest that that is not something to ignore. And that's something to treat very, very seriously. But who am I? I'm just a physician, just making simple observations, asking what I think are important questions. But the people who are in positions to influence what needs to happen, we can only hope that they take some degree of reflection on the challenges that are ahead. My warning is still very simple. If the spike protein is able to trigger an autoimmune response with infection, it's likely to do it for any other source of spike protein. And the higher the exposure of the body to spike protein, it is likely to represent a greater risk in the longer term to the population at large. It's not in the interest of any organization, any company, or any public health to ignore that question about the potential risk that could occur. I hope this is of value to someone, and let's hope that we continue to find people who will continue to ask important and challenging questions. Have a great evening.